Tom, another question from Scott is, you have said light is data. Is that correct? Well then, what is data? I have come up with the idea that it is the thought of the LCS. Could this be right? So from here, my mind jumped to the LCS, and I tried to understand consciousness. Please explain consciousness in its primordial form. Is it pre-thought? Is it pre-awareness? Its first coherent thought must have been, I am. Is this right? I've always wondered what this I am business was all about. And maybe now I understand?
Now, in general, what you're saying is correct, and you're musing as you kind of travel down this path, started with light and ends up with the existence of consciousness. In general, what you're saying is the right thing, but everything is a thought within the larger consciousness system. The larger consciousness system is a system of thought. Mind space. That's why it doesn't have distance there. Things aren't located, some things located here and some there. There is no here and there. There is no front and back. It's just a system of thought. You have things in the back of your mind and you have things in the front of your mind, but those are just metaphors. Your mind doesn't have a back and a front. Now, your brain has a back and a front, but that's not your mind. So in thought space, there is no spatial direction. It just is information. Now, this thing about data, you should go take a look at the list of definitions I have for MBT terms and concepts, because I do about 3 or 4 pages worth on information and data. And I'm not going to do all that here, but basically, information is the understanding, the point, the value, not the words themselves. You see, so you have a bunch of words, and those words contain letters, and that's the data. But a consciousness can look at those words and letters and come up with meaning and significance, content. That's the information. Information is non-physical. You can't take information and put it in a bottle. You can't weigh it. It doesn't have mass. You can't say that it moves. It just is information, and it has to be in a consciousness. There is no information that's outside of consciousness. Information is understanding, value, meaning, thought within a consciousness. So information is thought within a consciousness. Now, what about data? Data are the ways that consciousness can take that meaning, translate that information into data. And data can be sent from one person to another. So data is like language. The consciousness interprets the data into information, meaning, content. Okay. Now it wants to communicate that meaning and content to some other consciousness. So what it does is it takes that information and then translates it into data. That is, letters and words, say, if we're talking about a language. It takes, okay, I've got this information and now I had an idea and I've got this brilliant understanding. I need to share it with somebody. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to do my best to translate it into words using letters and language. I'm translating it into data. Now with that data, I can send it. I can send it electronically. I can write it in a book. I can do all sorts of things. I can store it. I can take that information, that data and store it. Now I can give that data to somebody else. And that other person has to look at that data, all those letters and, in various groupings and things with marks and whatever, them have meaning to them. So they take all of that data and they then have to create the meaning. Now you see both of those periods of creation where the consciousness created the data to represent its meaning. That's not an exact process. There's a lot of stuff that falls through the cracks or falls on the floors there because you can't precisely describe things in language. Language leaves big holes between things. You can only use the vocabulary you've got. You can only use as much of the language as you understand. Some people only have like 500 word vocabularies, and that suits them through life. Others have 5,000 word vocabularies, and others have even more than that. So depending on your capability with the language and your ability to turn those thoughts into words, because you may not have the right words. You may have to find nuance and you may end up having to go to poetry, it has to be interpreted. You just can't write it down in flat words because the words don't do that for you. And you send that to somebody else. Now they get it. They have to now interpret that data back into thoughts and ideas and meaning. And that's not an error-free process. Depends on their vocabulary, depends on their understanding of the world. They're going to look at your metaphors and come up with something that means something to them. And it may not be the same thing that you had in the first place. You see, so this world of communication has lots of errors that are natural to it. It's not an exact process, but a consciousness translates into data so that the data can be stored or sent someplace, sent to some other person. Now, the consciousness can also get data in, interpret it, get data from where it's stored, like a magazine or a book or a Word file. It can get that data and then it has to interpret it as to what it means. So this is how, but data is a physical thing. Data is a bunch of ones and zeros. Data is ink on a page. Data are little beads on an abacus. Data is a physical thing. Can be stored, can be moved around. Information exists only in a mind, and it has to be, and it's just what that particular mind knows. Some other mind is different. And when you translate from mind to data and from data to mind, there's lots of errors and things that don't translate well. So that's basically the difference between data and information. But all of this now takes place within mind. You just have the larger conscious system, which is a system of conscious system of mind. Has no space, has no separation. It's not like mind doesn't have that. It has understanding. And it can create data in a data stream, send it to us. We get the data, we interpret it as this virtual reality, you see. So do we interpret it perfectly? No, we make mistakes in our interpretation. We see things that aren't there. We don't see things that are there. We make errors in it, just as always.
This is why those remarkable writers who can transcend that data into information that's universal, those are rare, you
Yes,
know.
a really good writer who can capture feeling. You see, now if you're just enumerating stuff like how many books are in that library behind you, well, that's easy, right? Or what is all the words on those books? What are all the titles? Well, that's easy. But if you're trying to explain, because you're explaining what is, what you see, but if you're trying to explain emotion and feeling and larger concepts,
A
trying to
larger
explain,
concept like human condition, that's
sure,
what some of the great
or even a
writers
larger
do.
concept like a virtual reality.
Yeah.
See, when you're trying to explain these things, then it's difficult because people all don't have the vocabulary or the concepts in which to interpret what it is you're saying. So they read the data you send them, but it doesn't compute in their mind very well. So that's a difficult process. So yes, that's the difference now between data and information. The larger conscious system is consciousness. Consciousness is awareness with a choice. So it's still mind. It's mind that's aware of itself. Yes, in the first mind, the first little bit of consciousness was aware of itself, that it existed. And since it has to have a choice, that it was either in state A or state B, because that's the simplest thing. Any simpler than that would just be one choice. It was always in A, but that's not a choice. So you need two things. You need at least a binary so that you have a choice. So it says, I exist, and I can put myself in state A or state B. I can exist in A or in B. And that's the smallest piece of consciousness. You can call that a consciousness cell. That's all it knows about. Okay. Now, we can call, state A and state B, state 1 and state 0, if you like. It's the same thing. That's going back to our computer analogy. Let's say that's state 1 and state 0. So now it can evolve. It can say, oh, I was in state 1. Now I'm in state 1 again, and now I'm going to be in 0 and then 0 again. So I've had a 1, 1, 0, 0. That's a pattern. Now I can say, well, I'm going to give meaning to that pattern. I'm going to say a 1, 1, 0, 0 means I'm happy. You see, now it's starting language. It's starting to create words and language because it's associating feelings with patterns. All right, so that's evolution. It starts evolving. And then it does that for a long time until it's kind of done as many patterns of sequences of patterns that it can. And then it realizes that it will be able to grow more if there are other things with free will for it to interact with. And that's when it breaks itself apart. Or you can say the computer starts making virtual machines inside itself, setting aside a little piece of memory, a little piece of processing, a little partition off piece of itself that has all the things that the big thing has, but in much smaller amounts, much lesser capacity. So then each one of these little things has free will. So now those things can interact and have an argument or can pass data back and forth if they give them communication protocols. So anyway, that's how consciousness evolves. But it starts at I am and I am 1 or I am 0. I am in A, I am in B. Two separate things. That's what consciousness requires, awareness and a choice. If you just have awareness, then you don't really have what we call consciousness. For instance, trees might have awareness, but if they don't have choices, then we don't call them conscious. If they do have choices, if they say, oh, there's a little tree over there having a trouble, I'll go send him some nutrients through the root system, and that's a choice, then that tree is conscious. But if that's not a choice, if that's just the rule set, it's just, what do we call it? Stimulus response. It gets a stimulus and it has a response without thinking, and that's algorithmic. That's just automatic. That's not choice making. It just happens because that's the way nature has built it. Things, stones roll downhill. They don't roll uphill because that's the way nature has, rule set says that it works. So anyway, if you have thought and you have choice, you have consciousness. If you just have awareness, you don't necessarily have consciousness, but you could be aware of things. You could be aware of yourself. You could be the I am. I exist. That's awareness. But I am, and I can be more than just I am. I am, and I have input, and now I take this input with that input and come to a conclusion. Now you're having choices. You made the choice to combine inputs. You made the choice to even have inputs. Gather data.
That
That's a choice.
consciousness, that consciousness has potential. So
Right.
there is your potential for fear or
Evolution.
love and
Yeah.
evolution. And
Mm-hmm.
there's your choice.
Right.
That potential was something that the LCS, as your conjecture stated, once had to balance, had to deal with, had to see how that worked.
Now, if you go back to the ancient Hindus and you go to kind of modern mathematics, you'll see they both kind of see the same process. And that is first you start with a potential. And in the Hindu, that was the void, no thing. There was no thing there yet, but there was potential for a thing. It was, as they say, if you read that, there it's like it was pregnant with potential, but there was no thing there. Well, that's a system that has capacity, but hasn't actually made a pattern yet. You see, it has an A and a B, but it hasn't done a 1-1-1-0 or a 1-0-1-0. It hasn't actually started to make patterns yet. So it just has potential. All right. And they said, okay, you had this void, and suddenly, without any particular warning, the void coalesces into awareness, okay, because it had the potential to do so. So there was no thing. Now suddenly you got things, you got meanings, you got symbols, you got patterns of ones and zeros and sequences of patterns of ones and zeros. You've got something there that wasn't there before, and that starts to evolve and build. And in the Hindu theology, what happens is that you have the void, then it kind of suddenly produces Indra, something like that, and her net. And she has this net and jewels, and there's jewels at all the intersections of the net. Well, that just says everything's connected. Everything's on the net. I mean, with the way we use a net too, you're on the net. It's a network. Well, that's what they're saying. This creation was all connected. It was all on the net. And these jewels were the nodes of that net. So now we would look at it and say, well, you had a consciousness, and suddenly it created patterns, and then it eventually created other pieces of consciousness, and they're all in the net. All consciousness is all netted. Each one can interact with others over this net. And each one, every little IUOC, which is a chunk in the net, it's like a little jewel. It has potential. It has value. It can do things and create things and be things. That's the jewel in the net. So it created, so you see, we can talk kind of the science and computer science language, and we can talk old Indian proverbs, and they kind of hang together if you interpret it the right way. So, but again, the old poetry needs to be interpreted, and there's always arguments about what is the proper interpretation. So that's how consciousness started. Now, what does math have to do with it? There's a mathematics that basically says if you have a potential to be something, eventually it will be something. Okay.
Emergent
In other words,
complexity.
yes, there's the thing. It says if you have potential, that's complexity. Potential to be something, not just all the bits are random. There's no potential there. But if you have well, just having bits, I guess, is potential. Well, all the random, there's nothing. But then you start making bits that aren't random. You start putting them together, creating information. Okay, then if that can happen, it will happen, is basically the way it is. Everything just churns until it finds something that works. It finds something that's stable. So it's looking at the world, and I think this is probably based on Bayesian statistics, is that you look at systems, and if the system has potential to be something, it will be that. It will actualize that potential sooner or later. It may take a billion years, but sooner or later, something will happen that some kind of little process happens to create itself, and instead of dissolving back into the mess, it becomes stable. And then you can build on that, and then you can build more on that, and keep building on it, and you end up building a stable process. So it kind of, you're saying something kind of pops out of nothing, but not really. It pops out of potential. And it just takes time before that potential organizes itself to produce something stable that you can build on. But it has the potential to do that eventually. It will. So you look at just the statistics of something. If something is 1 in a billion and it samples 100 billion times, then 100 times it's going to come up with that 1 in a billion thing. You see, even if it's 1 in a billion, it may take a long time, it may not just happen tomorrow, but the more stuff it just randomly samples, eventually it's going to sample that 1 in a billion thing. And if that's the thing that is stable, that you can build on, then after that it starts building on it. And maybe that will someday crash and fall back down into the soup again, but it doesn't have to. And if it does, someday it'll build something else. You see? So that's the idea, that there's, the mathematics says that if you have a system with potential, it almost comes out of evolution. Everything that possibly can happen eventually will happen. If it's a possibility that can happen, eventually it will happen. And that is how you get something out of nothing. It's not really nothing. You have to start with the potential. And it's a matter of that potential creating something. But if a little piece of that potential creates something that grows, and if that growing thing finds enough complexity that it becomes sentient and says, oh, I'm this thing, then that's consciousness. So the way I've had to explain, and anybody who wants to go into detail here, go to Stanford Philosophy Department, look up cellular automata, and you'll get a lot of words there. Look for the part of the cellular automata discussion that talks about consciousness. What they basically say is you use these two things, the fact that something can evolve out of potential, given enough time. And the second thing is that things that have very simple little structures. I say something has to continue. You can't bubble up something randomly and have it all just disappear. But occasionally you bubble up something that is stable, and then it can grow. And that stability can grow, and you have something that can keep on growing. So what it says is that these cellular automata are just little rule sets. And if you follow the rule set, it allows certain things on a board to change in certain ways. Well, they have shown, when I say have shown, I mean, it's logically, it is a fact that you can have a couple of not too complex rule sets that allow these cellular automata to do everything that a general purpose computer can do. So your cellular automata can actually turn into a general purpose computer if it just gets the right kind of rules in its rule set. Now, how long might it take it before it ends up with those kinds of rules? Well, all you need is that it's possible. If it's possible, then eventually it will happen. So that's kind of the hand-waving conjecture of where consciousness comes from. There was a potential assumption Where'd that potential come from? Nobody knows. Okay? But there was a potential. Potential is beyond our knowing because we can't get outside of consciousness to look at its
And
own
it's this where
its own
your
birthing.
is this where your analogy of the system as a computer, the big computer comes in?
Yeah, well, it
It's
turns out that consciousness is a lot like a computer. That's just a metaphor.
a metaphor.
Consciousness, is an information system. That's a metaphor. But it's a really good metaphor because that really does describe consciousness. So what are you conscious of? What is your consciousness conscious of? Well, it's conscious of this and that. And, I'm conscious of you on my screen and, draperies hanging, lights, the ceiling, the lights in here, my computer. I'm conscious of all these things. Why? Because I'm getting all that as data. I get data from my eyes, from my ears, from my skin. I know that it's cool in here, not warm. I can feel the shoes on my feet. I can feel I'm sitting in a chair. So I have all my senses. Right now, I don't particularly smell or taste anything, but all the other senses are working, and I have data coming in. That's all your senses are. They're data collectors. Your eyeballs and your optic nerve and your retina are data collectors. So they collect information. Now, your consciousness collects that information and then it has to sort it and process it and say, well, what does it mean? Well, I'm an old guy, so I know about lights and computers and microphones and things. They're part of my world. So I give them all names, and that's in my world. Those are the things I see, and I understand how they work and how to use them. But I didn't understand that when I was born. I didn't know what an apple was, or I didn't know what mother was. I didn't know what I was. But I eventually found out as I grew up. So that's how you get that information. And now I'm able to look at microphones and lights and Zoom windows, and it all makes sense to me. It didn't when I was first here. So you learn how to interpret the data. Your senses collect data. You learn how to interpret it. That's the way consciousness works. Now, also, consciousness have to have memory because otherwise everything you observe would be the first thing you ever observed if you didn't have memory. There would be no other thing. It would just be everything would be the first thing. And with that, you could never do anything with it. There'd be no meaning in it. You get meaning from the fact that you have new data. You can look at that against the old data and see what differences are and come to conclusions about things. All right. And the last thing is that you have to have some purpose. And with consciousness, the purpose is to lower its entropy, create information as opposed to have all the bits random, which is high entropy. You want those bits ordered, which is information, low entropy. So an information system wants to create and store and keep and use and process information. That's exactly what consciousness does. Consciousness gathers things, it sorts the stuff, has memory to do that comparisons and that analysis. Then it comes to conclusions and it makes a choice about what to do next. How can I further my purpose, which is to lower entropy? So if you look at what does consciousness do and what does an information system do, you'll see they do exactly the same things. So this idea that consciousness is an information system, yes, it's a metaphor, but it's a darn good metaphor because consciousness really is an information system. That's a very good way to describe it. That's functionally what it's doing. It's a good functional description of consciousness. So using it with that metaphor that it's information, that starts to lead you to a whole bunch of other logical consequences of it being an information system. Well, if it's an information system, then, dot, 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 you can come to all these other conclusions. And it turns out that when you do that, all of those conclusions tend to be true. That's exactly what you find in the world. The world works just like that. So, as far as an information system can make a virtual reality, it can evolve a virtual reality. It could program a virtual reality, but programming is very inefficient. Evolving it is a much better idea. Then it's organic and it abides by a rule set. Otherwise, it's usually inconsistent if you were to just program it. So anyway, so you look at the information systems, what information systems do, and suddenly you realize you have a perfect description of the reality that you live in. So that's how it all comes together. But this consciousness thing, we don't understand how consciousness really came about. We can wave our hands and have some conjecture that there was potential somehow. Somehow means you really don't know what you're talking about. There was some potential somehow, and that potential eventually turned into something. The void quickened to become something, and out of that something appeared an awareness that could tell, oh, I exist, I am. Not only that, but I could be A or I could be B. I could be this way or I could be that way. At least a binary. So now you take that and you can build everything else. So just like the theory of evolution from Darwin, it's the same thing. If you give Darwin a cell, a living cell, he can explain to you how every plant and every creature evolved out of that cell. All he needs is a single cell that can split and make two cells, that can split and make four cells, that can, and can do this and that and create cell structure. And just give him a cell and he'll let that evolve into the cell structures, then splitting cells, then this and that, then bushes and trees and jellyfish and sharks and humans and everything else. Then he can evolve. And he'll tell you why a dolphin has that finger bones in his fins. Why? Because that thing was on land and needed these things to crawl around on the land, went back into the water and doesn't use them. It has joints in it too, where we have, two joints in each finger. It has two joints in each finger too. He doesn't need any of those joints in there, so it didn't evolve like that into a fin. It evolved first into a foot, and the foot turned into a fin. So there's lots of little mysteries, like why do dolphins have finger bones with joints in them in their fins that sit there as paradoxes? Gee, that doesn't make any sense. Why would a dolphin have finger bones in its fin? But then you have this theory that explains things, and suddenly, oh, that's why it started, went from the water to the land and back into the water. So that's why it has that. And then we can explain things that otherwise were mysterious. So this is the same thing. You understand consciousness, you understand what it is and how it evolves. And once you have that model, you start to be able to explain things that otherwise were mysterious, that nobody could figure out. Suddenly it's just as obvious as finger bones in a fin. Well, of course, the thing used to be on land before it came back to the water. That explains that. And obviously, this is how quantum physics works. And this is why relativity, has a constant c. And when c is not constant, you can derive all these
You derived all
answers.
of that from consciousness because you explored consciousness for so long. So you began your my big toe with consciousness and derived all of our
Yeah,
reality, including our physical rule set from all of that. It's really
yeah,
fascinating.
yeah. So that's the way it works. So it all starts with consciousness. But we don't know really what that first potential was and where did that come from. We just don't know. But that is not a failure. That we don't know isn't because we're stupid and haven't figured it out yet. We don't know because it's logically impossible for us to know. We are consciousness. We can't get outside of consciousness to look at consciousness being formed. We are a piece of consciousness. We're stuck in here. Now, I make that analogy in my book about talking about a bacterium in your gut. And what it does is it digests food. As far as it knows, food just falls out of heaven. Food just comes out of a big pipe. There's this big pipe and food falls out of it and it digests it. It has no idea about where that food came from. It has no idea about cows and chickens and turnips and fields and tractors and refrigerators and light bulbs in the refrigerator so you can see what's what. It doesn't have any idea about that, about cooking, about all the things that define food. It knows nothing of that. All it knows is that food somehow falls out of this pipe, and their job is to dissolve it into nutrients so that the body can use the nutrients. It breaks the food down into nutrients. So its viewpoint of the world is limited. It can't get out of the gut and see the fields and the farms outside. And even if it could, it wouldn't make any sense. If it looked at fields and farms, it'd have no idea what that was or how to relate to it. So it's not that the bacteria is just too stupid to understand farms. It just can't understand farms or refrigerators. It's just too far outside of its reality, its domain. And we're the same way. We're a piece of consciousness. So it's not that we just haven't figured it out yet, it's that we can't figure it out. So no, it's not an infinite regression. Oh, where did consciousness come from? The pencil. Where did the potential come from? Oh, something else. And where did that come from? Something else. And you get this endless regression of all the things. Something had to be the source of something else. But no, that's silly. You get to where did consciousness come from? And you can say a potential. And where did the potential come from? You just have to say, I don't know. And I can't know. It's not a thing that this intestinal bacterium can deduce. It's outside of my range of experience. I can't deduce that. So you just don't know. So you confess ignorance, and you're not stuck with this infinite regression. You're not stuck with any of the other kind of silly, impossible things that people go to. You're just stuck with admitting that you can't know everything. So you deal with what you have. So my book starts with an assumption that consciousness exists. I don't bother with all that cellular automata and if it's possible it'll eventually happen sort of thing. Yeah, those are good conjectures, but that's not science. So I don't deal with conjecture. I start with that assumption, consciousness exists, and I deductively deduce all the rest from logic, just like Darwin did. Darwin sailed his beagle all around and found things, looked at the things carefully, and found patterns. And from those patterns, he could deduce causes and purposes for those patterns. I did the same thing. My boat was out of body, and I sailed around in my boat, looking at the larger consciousness system, experiencing it, experiencing all the things that you could do with it, all the paranormal things and so on. And I saw patterns. And eventually I could see purposes for those patterns and reasons for those patterns, which turned into a theory of consciousness and the theory of reality, just as Darwin saw all his patterns and came up with reasons for the patterns and connections between the patterns and deduced the evolution of life on this planet. I deduce the evolution of consciousness from my travels around in consciousness. He traveled around this planet, came up with the evolution of the planet. I traveled around in consciousness, came up with the evolution of consciousness, of course. And when you look at the evolution of consciousness, you see how this physical universe cannot be anything else other than a virtual reality, computed as an entropy reduction trainer for individuated units of consciousness. So that's kind of the parallels. If you're looking at, well, where does consciousness come from and how do we know? Well, if you travel around in consciousness and you're a good observer, you look at it like a scientist would look at it, you'll see patterns, you'll see connections, and eventually you'll understand how that works. And consciousness evolution will become an obvious thing to you. So That's the only way to go. You can't travel around in the physical reality and find consciousness. It just won't work that way. You got to travel around in consciousness to see the evolution of consciousness. There is no other way, and that's where people get hung up because they refuse to admit that consciousness even exists, and then they're looking in the physical world for consciousness. It doesn't work that way.
Tom, I've never heard you explain it quite so eloquently and in such detail from kind of a different perspective as you have here today. Well, and Scott, we got some traction out of that. What is all of this I am business about? So thank you, Tom. That was really, really fascinating. Thank you.
I and MBT Events hope you like this video. If you do, then you should consider being a Patreon member, because Patreon members get early access to our special content. You will also be able to get your questions answered by me in special Q&A sessions, and most importantly, your contribution as a patron member will enable us to produce the content that you're looking for. So thank you.